We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the guns to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Byrne Power, the Anadromist, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains. And this week what we're doing is we have a very interesting conversation with someone I've recently become acquainted with in the last few months, Andy Edwards, a drummer of some reputation. He actually played with Robert Plant in his Priory of Byrne, and he's played with other progressive and sometimes jazz material as well. Over on his channel, which I highly recommend, he has been holding forth on subjects like prog rock, jazz fusion, classic, what we would call classic rock, but also punk rock and other species of late 20th century music, as well as having a great deal of respect for people like Louis Armstrong. Anyway, I got in touch with him back in February, and I mentioned to him that I had a video on the subject of Blackface Minstrelsy. And he was fascinated by that. It dovetailed into some of the same ideas he had been having. And since then, we've carried on a bit of a correspondence, and we had one just personal conversation between us. And he later invited me on his show and interviewed me. And what you're about to watch is that interview, which has already been on his channel. If you've already seen it there is no real difference between this one and that, except, of course, you get me staring you in the face. So, with that being said, let's take it away. And if you like this, by the way, you can subscribe to the channel. It's a new channel. I have a larger channel called The Anadromist, but this isn't that. This channel, The Anadrome, is more for ideas about music, movies, and other media and arts. So, enjoy, and allow me, if you are not aware of him, to introduce you to Andy Edwards.
Hello and welcome to this video. I am very honoured to have with me in Georgia, all the way over in wherever Georgia is, between Russia and...
It's not the Georgia in America, although
we'll be talking
about the Georgia in America.
So over in Georgia, you're between sort of Russia and North Africa, aren't you? Is that
between Russia and Turkey? Yeah,
Russia and Turkey. That's all. We have Byrne Power, and Byrne Power spent a lifetime studying American history, American music history and culture, and specifically the phenomenon of minstrelsy, which I have found fascinating, A, because it provides the groundwork for so many different popular music forms, but also because it is an area that is difficult to talk about, that people have mixed feelings about it. I wanted to put a background up, as you could see, and I had to search long and hard for one I could put up that I didn't think would upset anybody. So we are dealing with, and I think that one's okay. Can you tell them who this is? What this is a painting of?
Yeah, that's Haverly's Minstrel Show, going up to the, I believe it's the President Garfield, inviting them to the White House to do a show. Now, if you look at the size of the number of people going up those stairs, you realize this was not a small show. This was a spectacle. And you can come back. Yeah, but they went on up until the middle of the 20th century in one form or another. And in fact, minstrel music goes from, I think it starts in the very late 1820s, but certainly 1830s, and literally is the most popular music in America up until around the turn of the 20th century. But then it continues on as very popular. The most popular performer in the first half of the 20th century was Al Jolson, who performed in blackface. And in 1948, they did a poll where Al Jolson was ranked as the number one performer. He was the Beatles and Michael Jackson put together for America in the first half of the 20th century. And today, he's basically been erased. And in fact, when Warner Brothers put out a great video of the jazz singer, this first talking movie that was a huge sensation, what's really great about that, the triple DVD of that, was it had all these other acts that were the first recorded music acts, and they're playing live. And you just see the minstrel stuff all over this, even though they're not in blackface, except for Al Jolson. But all the way up until the 1950s, there were still, I think it wasn't until really the beginning of the 1960s that there were still these kind of really poor, bedraggled minstrel shows still kind of circulating around the South. And eventually it had to end with Amos and Andy, the comedians in blackface, having turned into black comedians, going on radio and television, and finally, again, dying out in the 1960s. That is a huge run, when you think about it. Rock and roll is not going to do that, not in that sense of being such a cultural milestone.
So, a few months ago, I wanted to explore these two ideas: is the Native American influence on modern culture, and I also want to explore how minstrelsy affected, modern popular music styles, which is an understatement, isn't it, in itself? Yeah. And so I knew these two interviews were coming up. I did a couple of videos, and it has been very controversial, and some people have pushed back here. So I am now about to do a video on blackface. So my first question is, why should we go back and study it? Why not just wrap it up and not talk about this?
Well, it's basically the roots of all the American music that people have loved for quite a while now, ever since jazz and ragtime music started spreading into Europe and other countries. It's all part of this cauldron of American music. And without understanding minstrel music, you don't understand the rest of it. It's this black and white mixture going back and forth, hall of mirrors. There's racism, but also, there's a lot of great music going on that would lead to country music and barbershop quartets and bluegrass and rock and roll and jazz and Scott Joplin was trying to essentially take the rags out of minstrel music and turn them into classical music. It's so complicated. I mean, you wouldn't have glee clubs today if in America doing that kind of those weird harmonies and stuff if it wasn't for minstrel acts. And as far as I can determine, the minstrel acts are also, besides being a seedbed for so much American music, they are also the seedbed for its nemesis as well, really commercial music. That is to say, I can't find any music that's really commercial. And I would define this commercial music as not having a form, but rather being a leech form, needing other forms to borrow from, to create something, essentially creating the musical equivalent of McDonald's, which has to be a repeatable commodity. And the first instance I see in history of this, I mean, there was popular music, sheet music before the minstrel shows, but you start hearing the harmonies and such. They're doing something to sweeten up that black music, which, believe me, the black music you would have heard in the fields or in churches in the 1830s would not have been sweet sounding to our ears. No. And
would this be exemplified, say, by like the Coca-Cola song, "I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing"? That type of song.
Well, essentially what happened was you have this you have these plantation songs. Now, I did a lecture, which we will link below. I'll give you
The
the
link,
book.
all your links are down there, and I'm
Yeah,
sure a
and
lot of
all the
my
visual material and all the
yeah.
musical material is in the lecture. And I've got two versions of it. I'm going to give you the version I want from my new channel, so I can get people coming over to my new channel, which is going to be more dedicated to music and media and the arts and such like that. So, but no, if you listen, there were different aspects of the music show. So the opening number was really fast and kind of zippy. Well, that's one of the characters. Zip Coon was fast and up tempo. But you listen to it and you say like, yeah, these people have listened to black voices, but they're not interpreting it that way, which is not unusual because that's how everyone first learns music. So that I have these great Chinese records from the early 1970s where they're trying to do something. What seems to have happened is they received the easy listening organ music. They received kind of pop rock. They received like Norman Greenbaum's Spirit in the Sky. They received all this stuff in the same load, and then they're attempting to do it, but they've got a whole Chinese approach to it. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. There's a moment when cultures collide, new things come. I mean, I often think that the English and their whole thing with blues, there is a way in which this is also connected to the whole minstrel cycle. But the whole thing of the jazz clubs in the late 50s, early 60s in England and the skiffle bands and stuff, they were listening to jazz at the same time they were listening to Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. And somehow out of that, they created these long guitar solos, which aren't found in the original American sources. Later, they would be an imitation of the English. But that's what happens is you have this collision. And America is all about the collision. People often will throw around the phrase, cultural appropriation, to which I'm sitting there going like, hey, without a cultural appropriation, there is no American culture, black or white, because the black folks and the white folks are all borrowing from each other. And occasionally you get like a Frank Sinatra who's coming from the Italian, bel canto tradition,
Bello Canto,
but
yeah.
suddenly gets near the jazz traditions of America, and pow, something new happens there. Or you get like Germans with their accordions going down to Texas and hitting the Mexicans, and then you have this conjunto music, Tex-Mex music, Flaco Jimenez, and all this great dance music down there. I love that stuff. I love the hybrids and such. But American culture is essentially the major two elements are black and white. And it's the Anglo-Celtic in specific, and then the West African as an aggregate, since that's where most of the slaves came from, smashing and creating what would eventually become nuclear fission musically. But in this minstrel stuff, which eventually creates country music and all these other forms, there is another thing developing. So when they're singing the slow plantation song in which there's an illustration musically in 1926, I think it is, of Al Jolson singing some of these really sentimental songs. But it goes back to the very beginning. They sing these slow songs about what it must be like to be living on a plantation. So, and of course, ironically, all this music, the original minstrel music, is not coming from the South. It's coming from New York City, from what the cultural entertainment district in that day was the Bowery, not Times Square, not any other place. But they create these beautiful tunes of like, life on the farm. And it's just like absolutely wasn't like that at all. So what they're doing is presenting the image of the black field hand in the 1830s in such a way as that it seems almost like a bucolic, beautiful, back to nature sort of life, which of course it isn't. And in that, you hear the harmonies that they're using. And eventually you'll hear these harmonies, like I said, in minstrel shows. You're going to hear them in Broadway. You're going to hear them in glee clubs. And it's all this patina. It's taking this, whatever the original might have been, and then putting this gloss on it. And that's the beginning of real commercial music as well. So it's like somebody at this point just went, and we're still feeling the blast today.
So to put it simply, minstrelsy is the all-encompassing American cultural form, isn't it? It's the root of so many modern American cultural forms, and this is why we need to understand what it actually is, rather than having either a romanticized view, which they had in the 1930s, or this view that this is horrific and it can't be discussed.
Right.
I just like to add, being British, it's so funny because you say it was dying out in the 1960s. Not here in the UK. We had the main, the Saturday night television was the black and white minstrel show that went on up until the 1980s.
Wow, that's great.
And that was
then
made.
Again, there's that Hitchcock movie, Young. What is it? Young and something.
Young and Fine.
But he's got this shot in there where he comes down at the very end, and you see this was in the 1930s of a guy in blackface playing. But I think that blackface minstrel music in America fit extremely well with music hall. And in fact, what happened in the late 19th century, more music hall elements came into America, and the minstrel music went back towards England. And you have this, that's, I think, where the real popular commercial idea of music, the late 20 years of the 19th century, is where you see this. Unfortunately, we have no recordings from this era. This is also the time when jazz and blues and all of these things were building. And would be, I mean, if we had a time machine, we would go back to about 1880 and start, looking at what was
working. If you watch a lot of British, I'm quite a fan of British films. There's a lot of 1940s British films where there's a nightclub scene, and we've sort of got that very British cocktail jazz thing going on, and there's blackface going on. Another thing that occurred to me in when I was growing up as a kid, there was a TV show called Rainbow, and Rainbow was all about celebrating all, being inclusive and celebrating all sorts of people. And it was a man with 3 puppets, and one of the puppets was called Zippy. And Zippy was like the antagonist in this thing with Bungle, right. Jeffrey Bungle and Zippy. As you talk, I keep thinking I'm aware of a much subtler influence in modern culture that's coming from what you're saying. And one of the things that just struck me was, I have celebrated the work of Louis Armstrong so much. I think the guy was an absolute genius, and he really lays a foundation. But as you're saying this, when you were describing that sort of bucolic, sort of nostalgic look back, a lot of the songs that Louis Armstrong was building his genius upon were those types of songs, weren't they? Like, Lazy Time Down South, that type of stuff.
There is a late Dutch art historian named Hans Rockemacher, who was really, I never met him, but I heard tapes of his lectures in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and he has these tapes on jazz history. He had probably the largest jazz collection in Europe in the late 1970s, and it was almost all 78 RPM. But he talks about Louis Armstrong. He says he worried about Louis Armstrong's character being praised too much by the white folks from, say, Chicago or something, and them essentially pushing him in a certain way where he became more like the image that they imagined. And so there's this whole back and forth. And you see it with a lot of characters, like if you look at Fats Waller. Fats Waller was often the happy black guy at the piano and stuff. But supposedly, you get him away from that having to perform that image. He played very serious music and did not particularly like having to be the happy black man. And so you have this, and of course you go back to these images called for the sheet music of coon songs, had these outrageous caricatures. Again, this is in my lecture. And And this is where we start getting into a hall of mirrors. But, what is Mick Jagger doing? Mick Jagger comes along. He's going to his favorite jazz and blues clubs. He's picking up all this music. He's evidently developed a real a fixation on Chuck Berry, among others. And then he's just doing his version, which one could easily say is a caricature of what he sees. Now I think the Rolling Stones are great, but you never get away. I mean, it's not just Eminem who's part of the mirror. It's also what's his name? The guy in Public Enemy with the clock.
Flavor Flav.
Flavor Flav, right? It's also him. He was walking down the street one day in New York City, and I was there, and I saw him across the street, and someone went, "Yo, Flav!" Now he had his arms on a white girl walking down the street, and he goes, "Yeah!" And I'm going like, he's doing it. He's
yeah, boy.
Yeah, he's exaggerating these caricatures because, I mean, this is one of the whole problems with America is we're constantly circling around each other. So while we're creating this absolutely amazing body of work that no one has ever seen before, this mixture of African and Anglo-Celtic and European music, meanwhile, we are also in these strange, tense relationships with each other. And I think the tension also is what helps to make the music so interesting, which is what makes, I think, a lot of today's contemporary music a lot less interesting because it's being controlled more by the producers behind the scenes, who are more interested in the numbers of sales statistics and looking at the computer screens and saying, "Oh, we got to auto-tune this up to here," and that's a very different world. I think Eminem may be one of the last people to come out of the old black and white world that starts back with the minstrel shows.
So one of the arguments I'd had on here is there's certain people that they don't seem to accept or believe, and they could be well right, because I'm not that knowledgeable, that there was integration going on between black and white in the creation of jazz and blues. I think that in New Orleans in the 1880s, 1890s, there was a lot more integration in those bands than has been made out. But how much integration was going on in the minstrel shows?
Here's the point. It's often said that Northern people in America do not want to be racist, and yet they won't live near black people. Whereas white people down in the South are maybe more openly racist, using language that would raise the hackles of anyone going to Columbia University or Harvard, and yet their friends are black. And it's this very strange thing. It's always there's three sets of culture in the South. One is the people who are related to the slave owners and the culture they brought in, which was the official Southern culture. The second is the poor white culture, or white trash, they're sometimes derided as. And the third is the black culture. Now, there's actually much more linkage between the black and poor black culture than either of them has with, we could call them the managerial class or the owning class. Thomas Sowell, in his book, Black and White, he talks about how essentially so much of the black culture that we typically think of black culture, kind of strutting your stuff and not taking any shit from anybody and all of this, is actually Scotch-Irish culture that came and lodged itself, particularly in the Appalachian Mountains, and they were totally connected. You can find, for instance, one of my favorite forms of music is this lining out that you find in the Scottish Islands, in the Hebrides. This wild Gaelic sounding thing where someone will say something and then it sounds like an ocean, these people. But they're the same people, centuries apart, are making music in English. in the Appalachians. And there are black churches right next door that do the same thing. And in fact, in all black churches, they have a style called Dr. Watts, in which one person says the word, lines it out, and then the congregation sings it back. Now, it's different in tone from the poor white version, but essentially it's the same thing. And you see this in the spiritual music. There's another form called Sacred Heart music, which comes down, and it's a beautiful form of Christian singing, very primitive, wild sounding in 4-part harmonies. But there are black versions of that as well. You find this everywhere. And it's, we tend to look at, I think the problem today is that people have no historical interest, or rather, to put it this way, they hear somebody say something about the past, and they don't have enough exposure to the meat of history to be able to say, oh, well, that's wrong. That didn't happen. And unfortunately, I do have a lot of exposure to these things. So if someone starts to say something, I'm like, no, it didn't happen like this, blah, 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 blah. There you go. And they look at you because they can't respond. They don't know anything. There's a lot of ignorance here. So the people who are saying things about, the people who made the subject taboo of talking about minstrel music don't understand that it's only by talking about it that we can understand the whole situation.
That's how I feel. Somebody said to me that they said you've got no right to what was their word, mete out. And I didn't quite know what they meant by this, but to mete out the origins of jazz. I can't think about it or wonder or ponder about it. Now, I don't come to this as a historian like yourself, and I really enjoy talking to people like you. I come to it as a creative musician. I'm a drummer. That's what I've done all my life. Right. And so I sort of have a gut feeling of how new music's created, how creativity works, what creative people are like, the places, the way they think. And I fundamentally believe that highly creative people are outsiders. If you said who created jazz, I would go outsiders. Mm-hmm. They're not part of black culture. They're not part of any culture. They reside in that, but they're exploratory people, and they want to cross the tracks. And New Orleans was an incredible place if you were willing to cross the tracks.
Right. Well, one of the things that happened in the late 19th century in America, again, we have almost no recorded evidence for this. There's a little bit at the end of the 19th century when they started to make recordings, is that black people saw white people pretending to be black people, and they said, we can do that better than they do. And so they went into the minstrel shows, and in some cases, they created whole minstrel troops. And of course, this allowed them to have, like Burt Williams is the first black superstar, late 19th, early 20th century, comedian and singer. Was there something wrong with all of this? Well, of course there was. But also, we might have to remember that imitation, it might be racist to imitate people of different groups and people and such, but it's also the highest form of flattery. Because when you imitate, if I imitate the way, I'll often, watch some British television show and I'll do that, all right, that kind of, certain kind of, all right, I'll do that now. You got the spotted dick, and does that make me think that all the British people are these kind of like dumb kind of guys? No.
The thing is, us British love that. We love it. It's because it's actually part of that. It's in our culture. Right. Because we have the royal family and we're like an empire and a colonial power and all this type of stuff. There's all this pomp and majesty, and every single, if somebody gets married, what the British do is show off their martial power back in the 19th century. We're still doing it today. Hundreds of people on horses with swords going, if we need to fight the Battle of Omdurman, we're ready. And we're still doing that now. And that is balanced by this almost like surreal self-deprecation. Right. And I think culturally that is in America as well. I call this the English aesthetic, and
Well,
it's very specific. Monty Python's full of it. So the
I'll
Beatles have.
I'll give you a great example of it here in Georgia. In Georgia, there's a ritual meal called the supra, and in the supra, everyone gives toasts, and these toasts become very poetic and meaningful.
I've heard about these. Yes.
Yeah. I think I told you this, but
No, it's I'm a massive Gurdjieff. I'm a big Gurdjieff.
yeah. Well, yeah.
He had the toast to the idiots.
Yeah.
You know the
So
toast to
anyway,
the
a friend of mine invited a couple of Brits to one. Now, I went to one of these. I passed with flying colors. They all thought I was basically Georgian. But the Brits came, and you know what the Brits do. If you give them a toast, they're going to slag off people sitting there. They're going to make fun of people. That's exactly what they did. Ooh, they did not go over at all. But that is the British aesthetic, to, push each other down, make fun of everything they can. And at the same time, retain a certain aura of seriousness about it all. It's a very strange combination of.
Oh, it is. It is. And after talking to you, I started to have a little bit of a read up myself, and certain things in there that I saw in Minstrelsy, I thought this is really interesting. Like the cakewalk, this sort of parody.
Right.
It's like I don't think it comes from Britain. I don't know, but it's a very British thing to parody the upper classes in the way.
Cakewalk actually is black people pretending to be in America, pretending to be hoity-toity white people.
That's what I'm saying. That's a very English thing to do.
Right.
That's a very English thing to do, to poke fun.
But who knows? It's like maybe they got it from the music hall, because we were getting, at the end of the 19th century, music hall was starting to come in as a major influence, and there was a lot more comedy and a lot more of this. Interestingly enough, in the black world, now I have a big collection of spoken word records, over 1,000 spoken word records, and in there I've got a very big comedy section. And in my comedy section, I do have a very big British comedy section, but I also have a very big black comedy section. And in the black comedy section, they are always making fun of white people, of Chinese people, of Puerto Rican people. That's America, though. You have all these new people coming in. Okay.
That's the first sneeze on my channel. I've not had a sneeze before. Byrne, you've done a first.
I got excited. So, yeah, I often get like sun sneezes and temperature sneezes.
Oh,
that was a talking about music sneeze.
The best sneeze.
Yeah, but no, Americans, and we also have. There's Irish American comedy albums, George Carlin being the pinnacle of that. There's my favorites. I mean, the nastiest of all are the Cajun comedy albums, which all have something to do with, shall we say, illicit relationships with dogs. And but it's part. Yeah. I mean, ethnic humor, ethnic imitation is completely part and parcel of this whole thing, because you've got people coming and going from different places. And at first, people make fun of them and point to them, the Polacks here and the Wops there and the Dagos, and they have all these different names. But after a while, they're your friends. Classically in Boston, the Irish and the Italians hate each other. But after a while, they're both from Boston. They both talk very similarly. They both have similar attitudes. To start talking about the Boston, which Sox are they? Red Sox? White Sox? Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for blowing that one. But anyway, so that to me is a certain level of American culture. All of this cultural stuff. Now, what's happened is this cultural Marxism has come in with the ideology of the victim, of the people who have been stepped on. Yeah, we could always do more. Obviously, there are a lot of, for instance, homeless people living on the streets in large cities in America, way more than there used to be. Interestingly enough, the people worried about victimhood really aren't worried about them. They're worried about, the marginalized communities. They have this ideology. So, whereas what I see in black humor traditionally, up until recent times, has been we're using the humor to fight back. We're using the humor to say, you can't get us down. Humor becomes a way of fighting, a way, but it, and sometimes, I mean, there is black comedy that I have records of. Not only could I not play it on television or YouTube or anywhere else. I mean, it's just intense, but it's coming from a spirit of, you think you had a tough life, listen to this kind of thing. It's a way of leveling the playing field. No one comes out unscathed. But of course, we have other ethnicities here. So we have, so much of American humor is now, besides the Anglo-Irish influences and the black influences, the Jewish influence is huge in humor, more than in many other areas. But when the Jews came in mass at the beginning of the 20th century, very end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, they went to the same places to be accepted. And in fact, Al Jolson, I mean, to me, this is America. Jewish Al Jolson, son of a cantor, a Jewish singer, a religious singer, puts on blackface to sing for white people in America. Now, you could interpret that all as, I don't even want to start interpreting that because it could be interpreted in so many evil ways. Whereas I think it was just about entertainment. It was about being accepted within the culture. It was about finding the things that were the best in that culture. His roots didn't want him going near that stuff, but that stuff was just so interesting. It was so good. The music that America was putting out. And later, I think it was in the 1940s. I can't remember which organization. I do talk about it on the lecture. But they came out and said, we want to thank you for all the things. Thank Jewish Al Jolson putting on blackface for all you've done for our black community. Because by doing that, you normalized black performers on the stage. So eventually, if you want to understand what happens is, and this is what the extras, these early musical pieces on this Al Jolson DVD set show, is they show that what happened in 20th century music was eventually the blackface was lifted. And you're left with people who used to be in minstrel troupes singing like, in fact, exactly as Bing Crosby. You see that Bing Crosby used to be in minstrel troupes. Bing Crosby developed his whole style out of minstrel troupes. Bing Crosby developed his style in Spokane, Washington, nowhere near a black center, from black voices as well as white voices. So you have this strange amalgam. So eventually you start getting all the crooners of the mid-20th century. Well, what that was that commercial element mixed with jazz, and that was and then there's no more blackface. And then you start finding that black musicians are able to rise like Louis Armstrong, like Cab Calloway, like, Duke Ellington, like Count Basie, and eventually, the black music just starts to rise higher and higher in estimation. But it took going through this strange period. One of the things I point out in the lecture, and I think this is very important, is, a lot of the old churches and cathedrals in Europe would have these gargoyles on the outside. And the gargoyles are like demons. But they're always facing out. They're like, they're facing away from the church. They're not allowed in. But in a sense, I look at the blackface minstrel music as being like the gargoyles of American culture. It's something that is there. It is not a good thing, but it is also an important thing not to hide it away and not to simply go up and say, you are all evil, because in fact, a lot of great music came out of there. A lot of great songs, a lot of, the origins of country music, the origins, it's involved with jazz, if not the direct origin of jazz. It's, ragtime music would be impossible without minstrel music. Bluegrass would be impossible. All forms of country music are related to it. But then again, later forms of blues. Doo-wop music, which is essentially a variant on the Barbershop quartet, which goes back to the people will argue which came first. There is the argument that all music in America is really black music or music stolen from black people. And that to me is just the most naive, ignorant thing that could possibly be. It has nothing to do with the evidence. And what I've looked for is the evidence. So that's what's important to me. Is I didn't go into this trying to prove any point at all about
no. The same here with me. I'm interested in this, and I work on my knowledge as a musician to actually listen to music and go, I can't hear I started playing jazz, trying to learn the jazz drums. And I was also listening to African music and learning the sort of 3/2 polyrhythms, the hemiomnias, all that type of stuff, the 6/8 feels. And they're playing early jazz beats and going, this doesn't seem to have anything to do with African music. The rhythms here seem like marching music. It's military snare drum music. Yeah. It's got a swing to it, but it's not the swing that you have in African music, because that's straight. That's that feel, not that thing there. And so. And the same thing when you listen to someone like Sidney Bechet, I think that they say these blue notes and these slides. Yeah, he's doing that, but there's also these florid, incredibly intense classical European melodies, that sound almost like French or Italian clarinet music.
Well, that's the thing. New Orleans was, in many ways, much more European. And French marching music goes into jazz. You don't have jazz without French marching.
But so I'm not a historian. I can hear it in the music, but also I know how music's created. And music's created by people in rooms having fun, and it's not all pure. They don't go, right, we're going to take from here. These things happen, and they happen in a way that is so chaotic. And like I said, it's outsiders will always want to cross the tracks. They'll always want to go and peek into what's happening. It's like the amount of white people that must have gone, I wonder what these black people are listening to. They seem to be having fun. And that would have been how that was assimilated. I think the Matt study I've done, I feel that jazz is really born out of two things. It's like downtown and uptown, isn't it? There's a lower guttural and visceral music going on, sort of marchy music, and then there's a sophisticated, the sort of more Creole and the sophisticated highfalutin, and they had to work together because, like you said, people would go, there's some work there, we can get some work. Now, the big crime for me after I spoke to you is I start to look at these black superstars that came out of minstrelsy, and their achievements culturally in America are incredible. Sorry, you froze then. I said the achievements of these black superstars that came out of minstrelsy in the late 19th century are incredible. So I found out that the first ragtime, it was not Scott Joplin. The first ragtime composition was produced by a performer who performed in blackface, a black artist. You probably know who that is. The first African American on Broadway, that also produced shows. The first to make $1 million. The first, all these firsts. And at one point, I was reading an interview with a blackface comedian in the 50s, and he was saying, "I know where this comes from, but." He said when he puts the paint on his face, it is no longer about that. It's a theatrical thing, that he felt that he was transforming himself.
Yeah.
When he did this, and he felt that it had been ruined. An African American said he felt that what he did artistically was ruined by taking the face paint off. And I think this guy said, "I'm actually darker."
Right.
I'm darker without the and I just thought, how could black people that we know black Americans' input into American culture is unbelievably incredible. It is.
Hmm.
I feel it's the X factor. It's the X factor in
Oh
there.
yeah, absolutely.
Because they're the one group of people where their culture has been messed with and taken away and all that type of stuff. So you've got creativity without something to latch onto. And the history is one of ingenious black people taking other influences and fashioning new stuff out of it. And I'm interested in finding out what that is. And as soon as you say this, people that they react against the purity of African Americans bringing Africa, So taking that idea of what's going on at the late 19th century, especially with the blackface performance, I'm really interested in these. How did minstrelsy start? Because there's this idea of minstrelsy in Europe, which is a completely different idea. It's people
Right.
walking around with lutes and floppy hats, and
Right.
So how does minstrelsy start in America?
Well, there's this guy Thomas Rice who did, in fact, watch black performers, probably on the street, someone busking on the street or something like that, and thought, well, that is really great music. He was a performer who performed in plays and such in the Bowery in New York City, which was the old entertainment district. Now, I think the blackface part of it came straight from the same tradition that would blacken up Othello. That is to say, it's an English tradition of putting blackface on to play black characters. Probably because there weren't a whole lot of black characters walking around the streets, certainly not that many in England that were theatrically connected. So,
But the other thing can I just jump in here, because in England we have Morris dancers, and they go around and they have these sort of very ancient traditional dances around in a circle and banging the sticks and all that type of stuff, and a lot of those perform in blackface. Now the problem we've had is that
certain Morris dance quality. If you look at my lecture at the earliest one, which was Jim Crow, he doesn't look like the big exaggerated coon face that we come to see by the end of the 19th century. It's basically, it's just a guy with black paint on his face. He doesn't have the exaggerated lips or the eyes that open up and become very, comically large. And there may be something to that, because there is the way that the Jim Crow character is dressed kind of does remind me a bit of Morris dancers, So anyway, they did this performance in the Bowery, and it caught on. Now, again, this is New York City. No one was thinking about this in relationship to slavery. Was there a racist aspect to it? Yeah, undoubtedly. But was it also flattery? Yeah, undoubtedly. This guy saw something. I mean, you see this over and over. You see Thomas Handy, who's black. W.C. Handy, who's black, gets his Memphis blues at the beginning of the 20th century from looking at black street performers. So evidently there was a lot going on the street. We often, I think our image of the past is so often colored by films. And films miss a lot of details, which someone like myself, who's really interested in the way things must have looked at the time. So one of the things everyone has is this idea that everything smelled really badly in the past. So someone said this, probably not in the way you're thinking. There were places that did, and then there were places that didn't. But one of the things that's true is that you wouldn't, for instance, most work in America that was done outside in a field was accompanied by some sort of music, black or white. Or you had guitar players, often, Blind Willie Johnson, Blind Lemon Jefferson, these people who would stand around. They made their money by singing for workers outside in the fields, on the streets. And often there were these people and other blues musicians who'd be sitting in these bars. They called the bars juke joints. But the musicians went away after they brought this little automatic record player in there, which eventually got called the jukebox. So there's this whole tradition of people playing in the streets that we don't see it now because, we see the occasional busker, but the streets must have been much more filled with musical people. There must have been more music. No one had their phone to listen to music with their earbuds in. People weren't listening to the radio. They weren't listening to record players. They weren't listening to anything. People made their own music. People made their own music at night. When people came over to their house, they practiced music. You would have heard piano playing. If you were in New Orleans, they needed piano players in some of the brothels. One of the great myths, Hans Ruckmacher points this out. He says, you did not have full-size jazz bands playing in brothels. You had a few piano players like Jelly Roll Morton, because this would have been too loud for the proceedings. This was music for larger places. It was joyful music. But I know enough about American music to know how many kinds of American music, and regionally, it changes from place to place to place. And it's really fascinating. But Thomas Rice saw some Black musicians, and I think he was probably pretty sensitive to the fact this is interesting stuff. But he was also probably incapable of making the same kinds of sounds with his mouth, of playing with the same rhythmic feel. And so what he does is, generally musically, there is an approach to music which is more European, and there's an approach which is more based in Africa. But in America, there were only about 4 or 5 elements left, including syncopation, the blue note, call and response, which, as pointed out, was in the white culture, which is one reason it survived. And then the coloration of the voice, the way Louis Armstrong sings, is certainly not bel canto, this beautiful voice. And there's one other one I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But
improvisation, perhaps.
Yeah. Although improvisation was part of Baroque music, I know that.
Yeah.
So, but the point is that in a Black setting, they would emphasize these elements more, but they might do the same song or the same style, but it would just come out differently. And in the white church or the churches. The white version of the Black song is what we call the spiritual, which forms around the same time as the minstrel music, which is to say, when someone's singing, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" Well, you can find some Black churches that sing in that style, but that certainly wouldn't have been the style that Black people sang in without going through a Europeanized treatment, so that in the Black churches they sang whiter versions of their songs. It's like I say, it's a hall of mirrors. It just is, after a while, one group is looking at another, looking at another, looking at another.
We're talking of centuries of development, aren't we? We're looking at African American slaves arriving in the early 1600s, and a music form in terms of minstrelsy emerging 200 years later, and then jazz and blues emerging in nearly 80 years later after that. So this is what I feel, that it's a chaotic thing, and it's also under-reported. And so
that's the thing. No one was interested in popular culture or folk culture in the 19th century as we think about it. There was no Alan Lomax to go around and preserve the sounds of these people. There was a bit of that in England that you find with like the Playford tunes from the 17th century and beyond, the old English country dance music. But that attitude hadn't quite come here. One of the big things that's different is you do have the shape note canon of church songs. But again, that's a totally different kind of a thing. And while there may be Black versions, we don't know specifically what either the Black or the white people sounded like, although we have recreations, which I play on my lecture, of the earliest minstrel music. And some of those, like I say, I find the origins of really sappy commercial music there. But some of that music is like, wow, that is amazing stuff. That's an amazing, yeah, we can't do what the black people are doing, but this doesn't sound like Europe anymore either. And that's the thing, is I often look at, how is it I can tell whether a piece of music comes from Europe, or, the say the British Isles or America like that. It's because it has some of those African elements in it in different sorts of way, a different approach to the rhythm than the European, a different approach to the singing, a different approach. Because country music, for instance, is the poor white version of the blues and other black forms. Whereas I look at the original jazz, particularly coming from New Orleans, as being more like a classical music. And I think that's what's really interesting to me about Scott Joplin, is you start with minstrel music, then you start adding more elements from the African community, the African American community into there, the black community. And then you have people doing these instrumental bits that start to become called rags. And you do have people starting to create this new ragtime thing. But Scott Joplin's looking at it, and he wants to turn ragtime music into classical music. And when he thinks classical music, he's thinking Europe.
Yeah.
That's why you find Scott Joplin's music in the classical section of a music store. And he, in fact, had an opera called Tremonisha, which never was done in his life. It was one of his biggest regrets. It really made him sad. And he started doing poorly after it was not received at all. But it was an opera, a ragtime opera that he had made. So here he is taking the opera form, taking this weird hybridized version of music, and then adding his own aesthetic to it, to create something no one has ever seen before and is respected many, many years.
But surely that is the thing that everyone misses, isn't it? Is that new forms of music have to be created in a certain way. It has to be in some way an integration of two different influences, but done in a way which is actually incompetent. Right. Or has the individuality of the person. I can remember as a kid watching. You talk about Bing Crosby. I was watching The Road to Bali. I was mad on one of the road films called The Road to Bali. And obviously, when they're in Bali, there's all these Balinese dancing and Balinese singing. And of course, it's not. It's this Hollywood version.
It's Hollywood Bali.
Yeah, and then in the 1950s, I'm a big fan of these Les Baxter albums. I love them.
Perfect example. They think that they're doing exotic Asian type music, but what they're really doing is something more closely related to Latin music, and with a bit of jazz and a bit of the little gourd and bird calls and things like that. Martin Denny, all of this stuff. Yeah, to me, that's an example of the opposite of what I was saying about the Chinese musicians. And to me, now, if you go to the Chinese imitation of American music, in the late 80s, I found this stuff in old record bins in Chinatown in New York. I wanted more, and I kept going back. And then I started talking to some of the Chinese guys, and they said, "Oh, you should listen to this band." And I bought this one band. It was just like, "Oh, okay, they've discovered production. They've discovered how to make it sound pretty much like a Western record." And they were listening to Led Zeppelin on the same day they were listening to Kenny Rogers. And it just doesn't sound good. It just is bad. And I noticed that all over the place. There is a point at which the music ceases to sound like something new, and then starts to sound like something strange, strangely unlistenable and bad.
Because they get that slightly more competent at actually mimicking it, rather than taking the idea of it and not being able to do it at all and creating something new.
But what they're figuring out is how to make commercial music, how to make their own McDonald's hamburgers, how to make Panda Express instead of McDonald's in the Chinese case. I think the story of the origins of reggae music are really fascinating because they have these super loud radio stations in New Orleans. And you'd take this great New Orleans rhythm and blues and stuff, and you know, do 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 do, and they'd be broadcast go over Cuba and land in Jamaica, and then Jamaica say, "Hey, Martin, we want to play this too." And so they started to play it, but they couldn't get the rhythm because that New Orleans rhythm is a very specific kind of
Yeah.
things, and so they kind of eventually create ska.
Yeah, I know.
Exactly.
It's
And
and,
that's,
they, and
to
that
me,
and
that's
the
the
early
brilliance.
ska, the early ska is closer to that rhythm and blues. You can hear it. You
Right,
can hear
right.
that. There's so many examples of this. I'm really interested on my channel in how minstrelsy affected the origination of jazz.
Right.
So could you go through that a little bit?
Yeah. Let me think about that for a second. I think that,
Well, can I just, while you have a think, the other
yeah.
day I decided to watch a Louis Armstrong concert that he'd done at the BBC in the 1960s. And
Right.
when I go back to this early jazz, I always feel very worthy because I'm going back to the source. But when I watched it, it was so entertaining because Louis Armstrong wasn't doing a jazz gig. It felt more like a variety show. Comedy stuff, solo spots, little
Hmm.
routines,
Right.
lots of
Right.
mugging, lots of port face pulling, and
Oh, yeah.
also featuring one person and then all coming off and then coming back on. And it was so entertaining. And I thought, Louis Armstrong, this is the minstrel show. He knew how to entertain an audience. He knew how
Oh,
to
yeah,
go
yeah,
out and
yeah.
entertain an audience.
Oh, yeah.
That is
And
what,
you
and
know, he saw minstrel shows when he was young
yeah.
because he just had to because they were still very popular.
And it's
And
almost like I started to think the big thing about bebop wasn't just let's get really complex. And the reason why it's complex is because that generation were trying to leave minstrelsy behind in a certain way.
right. Right.
And they're taking out the entertainment because it's still in the big bands. You see it
Well,
in,
I have a big question about the bebop revolution, and I've never found a good answer for it. But see, one of the interesting things about it is it's so much more existential than any music in the jazz blues sphere prior to it.
mm,
There are analogies in the classical world for
mm,
what's going on, but I'm sure these guys weren't really looking towards the classical world, not in the way that they were studying Schoenberg or something like that.
mm,
So, but it's interesting. The music almost fits perfectly with, say, the existentialist philosophies in France that were developing at the
mm,
same time. And I've looked to see, was Charlie Parker, were Miles Davis reading or in contact with these people, say in 1946 or 47? I can't find any evidence that they were. They were widely exposed to things, but I think it was is it Mary Lou Williams who's the jazz
mm,
pianist?
yeah.
I have a record by her that has a printed interview with her. And she talks about one of the things they all loved was what they called Frankenstein chords. And these were chords that they found in the soundtracks of films like Frankenstein, like Hans, what's his name, Salter, did this music that was kind of like poor man's modern music,
Mm,
modern classical. But they liked the irresolution of those chords. And she said, and she was in contact with all those people. And I thought, okay, there is a way and there is a trail there, some breadcrumbs between the modernist wave in classical music at the beginning of the 20th century and it working its way to Charlie Parker and these that is that through movies and the soundtracks of movies of particularly those kinds of movies. I found another trail, which I'm not going to talk too much about, which is much more clearly evidenced between Jimi Hendrix and a certain aspect of his sounds, the heavy, thick sound. I found what I consider to be the origins of not the bluesy parts or the jazzy parts or
mm.
all the other parts, but the thing he gets before anybody else is the thickness and distortion.
The purple
And that's
haze,
yeah.
the distorted flat five.
Yeah, but I found that
Yeah.
I found that around 1950 in some soundtracks, and I'm going to make a video on that someday. And I'll make sure I share it with you first, so you can shoot it down if it seems like it doesn't do the job.
Yeah, I mean, you've thrown up so many things there. I'll try and add in what I respond
But
to
I
it.
didn't answer your question
Yeah, let's
about
get.
jazz and minstrel music. Like I say, all the jazz musicians had to have heard minstrel music. Not only that, there was already at the beginning of the 20th century an idea of not quite standards as you would find in the middle of the 20th century. The classical songs, the torch songs, all the songs that people shared, but there was certainly a body of work showing up. So, for instance, I have a recording from about 1898. There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight, which sounds less like a minstrel song and more like jazz, although it's just done with a piano, and it doesn't squarely fit in the jazz category, but it doesn't squarely fit in minstrel music either. But that song, it doesn't take too much to imagine an early jazz version of that kind of thing. And I think what it was that there were already songs coming out of minstrelsy that were becoming, like I know all these songs, Jimmy Crack Corn, Way Down Upon the Swanee River, the Old Folks at Home, Beautiful Dreamer and such. I mean, and this sort of thing where this was like a background for jazz needs to improvise upon something. And I think that the minstrel songs and all the things related to that early popular music cycle, and especially the things we're not looking at in the late 19th century, were, in a sense, the seedbed, the thing upon which a lot would be based on. So whether it was the blues, with King Oliver, there's all these different blues pieces, West End blues and such by Louis Armstrong, that where you hear him. But if you listen to that music, it's related to, for instance, I hear a lot of connections with carnival music in the music of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So I know Christian hymns quite well, and there is a bad effect that started happening it starts in the 1870s in America. And it's when the kind of a commercialized romanticism started to affect the hymns. And the reason it did, I think there's one, you're in the first decade after the Civil War. So people are looking, today we'd say they're looking for feel-good stuff, but maybe then they would have something more uplifting. Next, there was this music going back to the Romantic era, the emphasis upon feeling and such. Suddenly, by the end of the 19th century, you start getting songs like In the Garden. It's just like he walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. So it's just like me and Jesus, we're together. It's just the songs start becoming more emotional. But here's an interesting thing about all those Christian songs, but not only the Christian songs. If you imagine them all being played on a what's the instrument? A band organ, a steam calliope, from a circus or a carnival, they all fit perfectly, because that was actually the carnival in America is actually a really important place for a lot of culture that a lot of people don't understand. And so this thing that's happening there, because it's smashing together, you'll get Italians and you'll get Swedish people and you'll get music hall people and all these people as part of, the Santini brothers spinning around in their acrobatics, and you'll get some French dog trainer doing a dog show, all of these things. But also the music starts to takes European music, carnival music in the European sense of the word carnival, and puts it in the traveling carnival of America. And you start getting these organ sounds and such, which had been developing in Europe for years. But now it becomes like a popular music, which, he flies through the air with the greatest of ease. And here's what's interesting. That becomes a major part of also the commercialization of music. So, but one thing that the jazz artists are really good at and you can see this all the way up to Coltrane doing Chim Chim Cheree. Is that or Miles Davis doing any number of different popular tunes? What was it?
Someday my prince will come.
Yeah,
That
but
would be
also
that's a
even doing the Cyndi Lauper tune,
time after time. Yeah.
Yeah, the jazz would always feed. Jazz would feed upon the blues. It would feed upon other forms. But see, I think minstrel music had already created such a body of songs that it gave the jazz people kind of a soil to feed in.
I've had an idea. I've just had an idea talking to you because I'm talking about so many different people, and something just occurred to me that I think is quite interesting. When I was a kid, I learned to play the drums. I listened to Led Zeppelin, I listened to Jimi Hendrix, all those bands.
Right.
I learned to play the drums. One day I'm sat in my house. This guy comes around. He says, "You want to make some money?" I went, "Yeah," and I joined his covers band. And we started off gigging in the local area. Now, I didn't see that as being what I wanted to do, but I was making some money playing. And we would go out, and what we would do, it was a drummer, a keyboardist, and a singer. That's all we had back then. We were on the sort of cabaret circuit, and we would go in and we would play a whole bunch of songs. And those songs together didn't make sense. We would do like a Motown song, and then maybe a Beatles song, and then we'd do Lady is a Tramp. And if we got to a place where there was more like old school dancing going on, like ballroom dancing, which has now died, but was still around, then it would be more stuff like, do you know any foxtrots, Andy? And I'd be doing foxtrot. So one of the things I've realised is all these bands in New Orleans, all these bands, they're that type of band. They're basically going around playing a body of different songs that don't relate.
Right.
Now, if you think back to, say, if you take like something that is much better recorded, the development of rock music, especially here in the UK, that I know so well, that really comes out of the trad jazz boom in the late 1940s, people, like Chris Barber and Humphrey Littleton, which is doing a very English version of trad jazz, and also Lonnie Donegan and the skiffle movement.
Right.
Which
in many ways doesn't sound at all like Leadbelly.
No.
He's inspired by.
Yeah. I mean, you cannot get anything more English than, when Lonnie Donegan sings Does My Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavour on the bedposter? That is like the most English musical thing. And through that what emerges out of that is then a British version of the blues. They're playing all cover. This is why everyone says, Led Zeppelin. They were playing other people's songs. And I'm pretty sure that what you had in New Orleans that was special was this idea of uptown and downtown. So I think it was downtown was where the Creoles went. They'd been trained in classical orchestras. They could read. They're playing these tunes, but they're reading arrangements of these tunes. There's a strong marching influence in there of this as well. On the other side, you've got the African-American community, and they don't read so well. See, I have this theory that the word jazz actually comes from the fact that the snobby Creoles were looking at these other players, and they go, they can't read, they're jazzing it. They're jazzing it. That's what I think. It was a name for people that were playing head arrangers. I'm one of those players. I don't read music. I do now, but as a kid, I was out playing songs, and then you'd have proper bands where you'd get a job with a comedian. I can remember getting a gig with a comedian, and there was a chart, and I had to try and read this chart, and that's always gone on. These are always the things, and I think there's a coming together because of the Jim Crow bit, and the fact that the Jim Crow thing is going like this all the time, is it? One person is one status, and then next they're over here. And like you said, black musicians are going, we can get some work here and all this type of thing. And the reason, one of the things that really shocked me the other day, a couple of days ago, I was reading about the jobs that people did in New Orleans around about 1890. I saw a thing all written out. So I looked at the black. How many black policemen were there in New Orleans at that time? 379. How many? So that's the actual number, because I remember that. How many black musicians, professional musicians, were there in New Orleans at this time? 7. 7. Right. By 80, I think by 10 years later, it's gone up to 63. It's something like that. So there's been an
Right.
increase, but we're talking about something that's, I think, so small. There's
Right.
a lot of amateur musicians, and it's all to do with this. Now, another thing that I want to throw in here is the story about Big Bill Broonzy. That, he was like a very sophisticated, urban
Right.
musician. And when he heard that there were people down south looking for sort of Delta musicians, he came straight back down and put the overalls on. And it's like that Lead
Right.
Belly video when he's promising, is it Alan Lomax? He's sort of going,
Right.
I'll be a good boy. I know I'm a murderer." All this stuff. I feel that another thing that nobody takes into account is the fact that when something starts making money, then everybody starts doing it.
Right.
And
Right. Right.
once the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which they recorded as a novelty band, didn't they, in New York? It was supposed to be a novelty record. Then it sells 1 million copies. How many of these bands were actually doing something completely different? And they went, "Oh, hang on, we
Oh
can
yeah,
play
yeah, yeah.
that."
But we've seen that over and over.
Yeah, over. I mean, Louis Armstrong. See, I've got to watch what I'm saying because people say, "Oh, Andy is trying to say that the original Dixieland Jazz Band invented jazz," and we know that they did. And I'm not saying that. You got Freddie Keppard, Sidney Bechet, Buddy Bolden. I'm not saying that at all. So I've got to watch my step. But my
Well,
point
there was a
is,
lot going on in Kansas City that we don't
yeah.
know about. And we know a lot of jazz started there as well. So, I mean, it's a complicated story.
I mean, by the
The-
early 30s, the Kansas City is perhaps the most important city in jazz. And I think when you talk about the bebop sound, I think the part of the bebop sound comes out of Kansas City, not just because of Charlie Parker, but I think that big band tradition of playing sort of double time at half time thing. But I feel that there's certain influences that people will discount. The fact that people play stuff for money and it's not necessarily what they like. People
Right.
will, if you've got a bunch of musicians, they're into certain style of music, and then suddenly there's a wedding, and they say, "We'll pay you this amount of
Well,
money."
that's
They'll
the
go
thing.
out.
Charlie Parker
Yep.
played with us, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, the artist
Yeah.
plays
I mean,
weddings.
he play a bar mitzvah at one point.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so there you are. It's a complicated world.
But
And I
but but,
love that.
but Parker was a genius, and I think that's what nobody wants to count in. That is the individual genius. I mean, he obviously, that famous story of him going out and hanging outside Igor Stravinsky's house, waiting to see Stravinsky come out of the, because he was in awe of Stravinsky. So obviously, where was he getting some of this stuff from? From modern classical
Very,
composers. He knew
yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
quantum physics. He knew about theory
Well,
of
that's an interesting
relativity.
story I hadn't heard of. I have to look that up because I'm trying to make the connection. See, I look at there's a pattern in that we start to see in different forms of art, but we see in music we see it like this. Up until we'll say a little bit before Beethoven,
Mm,
the musician was seen essentially as a glorified servant. Bach never saw himself as the musician. He saw himself as really good, really great. You wanted Bach to compose your
mm,
cantatas for you in churches. You wanted him to compose stuff for you, make some chamber music for your chamber. But he didn't see himself as a capital A artist. By the time you get to Beethoven, Beethoven does. And by the time you get to his string quartets at the end of his life, particularly the Gross Fugue, he's making music now that's prophetic. He's saying, we're going towards this
mm,
angular
mm,
direction.
mm,
And later on, Wagner comes along and says, we don't really so much care about God anymore, but we care about music and art. And the highest form of religion, essentially, is opera, where all the arts and music combine. But then that gets too big, the orchestras get too big, and so you have the prophets who come along. So you have like the Messiah, the religion, and then the prophets come along and go like, we have to get back to basics. So you have people like Schoenberg come along and say, no, 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 we're just using way too much music here. We need to get back to just
mm,
music. And then eventually you get to the apocalypse. So in music, you get to people like John Cage and Stockhausen, who are making the dividing line between music and noise disappears. Now, eventually, they did that in about 100 years. when you look at the history of jazz, you see that the early jazz is essentially like Bach. They don't see themselves as big A artists. They see themselves as entertainers. They see themselves as musicians for people.
Yeah.
But by the time you get Charlie Parker, though, is Beethoven, and then the people around him, and then the Beats and hipsters are forming the religion. And then you get to the Coltrane's and the Colemans, and they are the prophets, purifying the sound. And then finally you get to free jazz and Albert Ayler and those people. And now you have this apocalypse. Rock, and so that just takes, what, 25, 30 years? Then rock comes along. You could almost say that the Beatles did the whole thing in their career. But you start off again, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, they're just musicians, you know. Then the Beatles come along, but the Beatles at the beginning are just musicians. And it isn't until they run into Bob Dylan who says, you're not really doing anything with your music. And then they start, in a sense, I look at Dylan as the messianic figure with the voices of the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix coming out of him, like, you know, some biblical image of the dragon with many heads. So they are the new messiahs in a sense. And then you get to the religion is the hippies. The religion is what happened in the 70s. And then you get to the prophets who are like the punks. And then eventually by the time you get to the grunge era and noise rock in New York, you get to the apocalypse. But like I said, you can look at the Beatles who go from just being musicians to being messianic figures who have a religion based upon them. And then John Lennon is trying to purify it. And then you have Revolution Number 9 and Yoko, all within their own time frame. And so, but I think it's not an accident that this looks like the story of Christianity as well. That is to say, although a weird variation on it. And I think one of the hallmarks is we no longer live in that time. That is to say, I can't see anybody today coming out in a messianic form. I look at like Taylor Swift, whom I've been really seriously looking at, trying to wonder why she's so popular. I look at her, she is kind of messianic, but the truth is she is a commercial figure. Whereas the Beatles graduated out of their commercial phase into art, you know, where they started really exploring the form. Whereas Taylor Swift, yeah, she certainly has a lot of art to her, but she never loses that commercial appeal, you know.
You've I mean, not only have you just wrapped up the whole history of at least Western music.
It's the whole history of the modern world from the Renaissance until the end of the 20th.
To me, it's the moving from music as being revelatory. So the musician is exposing what God has created. They're sort of going, oh, look what I've discovered. You know, Bach's going, it's that Renaissance idea that the sculpture is inside the rock, and you're exposing the beauty that God's created, to moving to be sort of a Nietzschean, like you say, existentialist eye, you know, where you stand up and you are the center of the universe now. And that dialectic, I think, is, you could see in all sorts of, it's almost like a circle that may be bound in an album, or musician's career, or style of music, or the whole history of, you know, Western sort of culture. I think you've hit on that. I think part of the things that it's like when the American classical establishment were looking for the next great, you know, the first great American composer that would rival the European composers, they were looking in the wrong place, because it was obviously Duke Ellington. It wasn't whoever they thought it was. And I think as you're saying this, I'm thinking about YouTube. YouTube is going through that right now. That when YouTube took off, it was originally just people, pure entertainment, a cat video, stuff all, you know, somebody falling over, all that stuff. And then it slowly emerged, and you've got to a certain point where certain YouTubers have come out, and they're like the Beethoven. They are suddenly like Mr. Beast. And Mr. Beast is almost like he's almost like the prophet now, because he starts off, you know, sort of nailing YouTube videos, and now he's going off curing the blind. and he's going off digging wells across Africa with all his wealth, and now you're moving into sort of an abstraction, which because I found this with my channel that I'm surprised what I'm doing. I started off just doing like a service, and then I've moved towards something else as YouTube's changed. So my point is, it may well be happening within online, on YouTube, on TikTok and Instagram, within computer gaming. I'm sure if we studied computer gaming, we'd see the same sort of thing playing out.
My point is that this happened much quicker. See, we're in the Messiah prophet. It's all happening at once.
Well, the thing is, we could well be in the fact that it's a week. So that
in the modern era, people would always look back to some point in the past to bring inspiration into the present.
Well, so, you know what? My mate Kevin Gammond, who played with Robert Plant in the band of Joy, he learned to play rock and roll in the 1950s. And I said, how did you learn to play the guitar? And he said, basically, I had an acoustic guitar, and I got a pickup, and I would play it through the family record player. And I would put Radio Luxembourg on and wait for a Chuck Berry song to come on, pick up the guitar at that moment and try and nail the first few chords, and then I'd have it down and try and retain it. And if I got it, I'd go around my friend's house and show it them. That was the speed at which they could assimilate stuff. For me, it was a lot quicker, but I'm like old enough now to remember having to go down the library, get out encyclopedias on jazz, which is why I know a little bit about the history, go through them and go, oh, that person looks good, and then travel around because the records were deleted. Travel around. If I was on holiday, I'd go, Mom, can we go to the record shop? So I'd go in, go, right, I want to find a Don Ellis album, because I'd read about it. And so that was quicker. Now, that sort of it's almost like it's almost like the idea that we are the center of the universe, and the universe is all inside us.
Well, it's all.
Or we're like a speck. It's like the pale blue dot against the sort of matrix. It's that I think that viewpoint, which is basically the dialectic of the brain hemispheres. Basically, I think that's why art goes through that. But we've got to such a heavy area, and I think we're coming up to 2 hours. So I'm gonna, you have. This has been fascinating. You've got to come back. You know that, don't you? You've got to be a regular.
We can do it on any subject. So
yeah. It's. I've realised it's not just minstrelsy, but I hope. I'm tackling these. I want to tackle the taboo subjects on here because I'm a contrarian. I'm a creative person. Right. I want to stir the pot. And I've said with the Ben McAnin one at the end, I just want to say, if you're watching this and you have been upset by anything that's been said, we're just exploring ideas. You don't have to get annoyed. You don't have to agree with us. You don't have to, don't have to agree, but just listen. And, I agree with that, or I don't agree with that.
What I suggest to anyone is this: if you think I'm wrong, do your own research. Dig into the history for yourself. Don't just go to Wikipedia and read what's there. Wikipedia is a fine place to start. It's a terrible place to end. But do your own research. And if you want to say, well, Byrne, you're absolutely wrong about X, well, don't just say that like you know something. Say it when you know something. And then I'll go, oh, you know what? I think you got the point, because to me, it's about the evidence. It's about what it suggests. And there are all sorts of things that the larger media frame present as mythology that didn't happen the way it is. And the older you get, the more you start realizing what they're doing with the history you remember. And you say, wait a minute. I'm old enough to remember the tail end of the 60s in the San Francisco Bay Area. As a kid, I was in my early teens, and I'll go like, no, wait a minute. San Francisco didn't happen that way. It wasn't this great moment where everything suddenly got good. It was actually, it had a beginning, and then it crashed, and part of that crash was the Altamont Rock Festival. And yes, Manson was connected to that, and the Satanic Bible, and all these other things. There was something happened. I think there was a hope that through drugs and such, we would find this truth inside of ourselves. And then as everyone started acting like children, you suddenly realize, wait a minute, no one's becoming an adult. And so that's like one mythology, but there's so many. And the mythologies surrounding what happened in American music are not nearly as simple as the ideologues would have.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that about San Francisco, because I once did a gig with Tim Rose, and I got up and played Morning Dew, who guested with us when I was playing with Robert Plant. And when I was backstage, he said exactly what you said about that scene. That he said it lasted for a certain amount of time and then it turned. And that was the guy that wasn't just in it. He was like Tim Rose. He was the guy that brought Hey Joe to the to Jimi Hendrix. I'll throw this one in because I got told this the other day and I found it fascinating because when someone's watching this and they've got a different opinion, everyone does bring their viewpoints. This is the whole point. We need to talk because people need to bring all their viewpoints, including the people who see this as a little bit more based upon identity and don't like my take, where I'm going, well, what are black people? What does it mean? I'm a bit, I understand that now. I'm tempering my approach because I'm not a black American. I don't have that experience. So I was chatting to my friend Kevin Gammond, and he said when he was down in London recording their demo with Robert Plant and John Bonham on drums, he said they finished the session and they came out of the recording studio and they went to walk down to where Ronnie Scott's is, and out of Ronnie Scott's walked Elvin Jones. And he said he was wearing red velvet trousers, and he said John Bonham got so stressed out because he wanted to go up and speak to Elvin Jones, but he was too scared to, he was too intimidated, and he chickened out. And he said, but there's this, when he told me this, I thought, nobody knows this. Nobody knows this fact that there's a moment where John Bonham is on the same street of Elvin Jones, and he's looking at Elvin Jones going, oh, I want to go, oh, I'm too scared to. Why don't you go up, John? Oh, I don't want to. And I've looked at so many YouTube videos where they're trying to work out what his influences are. Because he's dead and nobody knows what John Bonham. So what is the roots? What was he listening to create that John Bonham? And that's what everyone's trying to work out. So when Kev said, oh, was he into Elvin Jones? Went, oh yeah, he loved Elvin Jones. And suddenly you go, yeah, those drum solos, they do sound a bit like Elvin. And I said to Kev, I said, who do you think his biggest influence was then, Kev? And Kev went, probably Ringo Starr. And as he said it, it's so obvious.
Right.
That is what people, that these stories, as you talk about it, there's people have got memories or they were told stuff and they've got different tales, and we need to bring this all in. If we put up these barriers and say we can't talk about this, people won't talk about it.
Andy, here's the video I want to see from you one day. I'd like to see you go through all those early, there's that moment when they start making long rock songs about 1966, 67, up until about 1970, 72, and you start getting these drum solos in there. I'd like to see you kind of go through those and think about, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida and Toad and,
That would be brilliant. The thing is that's so interesting is that when you listen to the big rock drum solos, it's straight out of Gene Krupa. Gene Krupa is one of the most important people. Yeah. He's virtually the first pop star, the first person to play a proper drum kit, not something covered in coconuts and Chinese symbols all around. He's the first person to be sort of instrumentally worshipped. He's such an important guy, and that solo that he did, he was able to take the drum solo and make something out of it that then you see in every single rock band in the early 70s. It's Gene Krupa. It's Sing, Sing, Sing.
I've got a great early 60s Verve recording of Gene Krupa versus Buddy Rich.
Oh, yes, I know. Yeah, I know the one, yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Oh, we're going to have to finish up there because I've got to go get my kids from school. But it's been lovely speaking to you. Do you want to say goodbye to everybody so we could have the wave the hand goodbye?
And I'm going to send you the link you should use for my...
Check Byrne out right now. If you've enjoyed this guy knows so much, right? And his videos are so interesting as they're annotated with photographs and all these types of things.
I just put up a video called, I redid a version of it called Noise Enters Music. So it's a history of how music became noisier and noisier in the 20th century.
That's the next one I want to talk to, because that occurred to me as we were speaking. The idea of heaviness, the idea of how heaviness emerges in 20th century popular music. I'd love that to be the next one. Right. I'd love to talk to you about that. Anyway.
Okay, Andy. Thank you for having me on. And maybe I can, after you've aired this and it's been on your channel for a while, maybe you can send me a copy of this and I can put it on my channel.
Yeah, of course you can. You can have it straight away. You don't have to wait. I don't care.
All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Andy is a great person to talk to, filled with his own opinions, which I appreciate. I appreciate someone who has thoughts and is not simply agreeing with you or just kind of blankly staring at you. Andy will challenge you. Andy will have things to say, and he has lots more to say on his channel, and there's a link for that down below. So anyway, from Tbilisi, Georgia, where they say droabit, which means temporarily, just for a while. We'll be apart, and then we'll be back together again. We will meet again.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.
Thank you.